All right, welcome back to this week's Sports History Look Back. I'm here with my good friend Clayton. How you doing?
Doing great. I got a little sleep in after the
Nice.
long nights of basketball.
Yeah, it's been a great week in sports. What have you been watching? It sounds like a lot of the tournament.
Yeah, mostly all the tournament. I did catch a little bit of the Denver Nuggets game, and I caught a little bit of the Mavericks tonight. But yeah, mostly college basketball.
Yeah, I thought the best game that I've seen so far was that St. John's win. That
Yes,
was fantastic.
St. John's game was fantastic. The Nebraska game was fantastic. So
Yeah,
not
it's
as
fun.
many buzzer beaters and not as many upsets was something I think we're going to have to get used to in this new era, but still some good games.
So I took St. John's in the tournament in my bracket, and I think it's because we were talking about Rick Pitino and the St. John's program in our previous weeks, and I was thinking a lot about it and just kind of stuck in my brain. And I'm like, I'm gonna. I remembered a lot of the points we brought up, and just why not?
Yeah, why not ride Rick Pitino? He's been there before.
Yeah. And then I do want to just say I saw also the UConn game against Furman where Terrace Free Jr. just went off 31 points, 27 rebounds, a monster game. Guy's really fun to watch.
Yeah, that UConn team is going to be hard to beat. Alex Caravan is fantastic. UCLA had nobody that could stop UConn in their second round game. And unless UCLA figures out how to get and maintain a big man and finds a secondary scorer, they're going to have problems moving forward because with no Tyler Bilodeau, he was
Yeah.
their only scorer all year. If you needed a bucket, he was the guy. And without him, there was no second guy to give them any offense.
Yeah, I know you and I, we don't have a lot of the same teams we root for, but both of us are Bruins fans, and I think we were both watching that, hoping that UCLA could pull off a shocker. But they don't really have a lot of margin or error, and it just didn't have enough, like you said, against UConn, and so UConn's moving on to the Sweet 16.
Yeah, so pretty good region
Yeah.
there in DC this coming weekend.
Yeah, so speaking of the Sweet 16, let's get into our history for this week. We actually talked a little bit about the Sweet 16 going back to 1996, where a big time Syracuse team had a win over Georgia. It was John Wallace. He had a long pass down court to Jason Cipolla, who tied it with a jumper with 2.4 seconds. And then Wallace got the win in overtime with a 3-point shot. And that was a really beloved Syracuse team back then. And, we talked a little bit about that and just the fun of that team. And what do you remember from that team?
Well, it's always funny about when you think about a franchise or a university or a school and about who everybody remembers and loves. And it's not always the championship team. And I would argue for a majority of Syracuse fans that this 1996 Sweet 16 team was the most beloved Syracuse basketball team, certainly in recent memory, even more so than the Carmelo Anthony National Championship team. And remember that Carmelo Anthony National Championship team, that is the only national championship that Syracuse
That's right.
has. But the connection that this fan base had to this particular team and John Wallace in particular, I really think if you polled Syracuse fans that have been fans clearly for 20 or 30 years,
Yeah.
that they're going to bring up this team and how much fun this team was to watch.
Yeah, I think the magic that team had, a lot of people didn't really expect them to go as far as they did. They had kind of that blue collar underdog vibe. They had sort of that, everyone was really likable on that team. It was all about the team effort versus the Carmelo Anthony team, which was fun, but it had sort of that flair and that swagger, and all kind of the offense kind of funneled through Carmelo Anthony and he had a supporting cast, but it wasn't really like a team effort. And I always feel like those the working class teams, those blue collar teams, those are the ones that really attract fans, and people just love those teams.
Also, you knew with Carmelo Anthony that it was going to be 1 year and 1 year only. It was
Right.
win or he was going to the NBA, or lose and he was going to the NBA, and it was a short stop. But John Wallace was a guy that was there for 4 years in an era when, you know, you used to do that. You used to go and play to university and be there 4 years, and you used to have fans that would gravitate to you and grow with you.
Hmm.
Uh, and he not only was there 4 years, but he was a New York guy, which is always really important. We talked about it with St. John's. It's important with Syracuse. He was from, up in that, Rochester, Buffalo area. Came down to Syracuse. He was Mr. Basketball in the state of New York. He was a Gatorade Player of the Year. So there were a number of people that were anticipating John Wallace when he first arrived on campus. And at the end of his junior year, it looked very much like he could test the waters, go into the NBA. And he didn't love the feedback that he got. He knew that there were some things to work on, and the celebrations that ensued among the Syracuse campus when it was announced that John Wallace was coming back for his senior season, it just electrified the whole season, knowing that you had John Wallace for one more year.
Yeah, and I think one thing that's always struck me about, and it's not just John Wallace, but I think players overall that are kind of well rounded, that depending on whatever part of the game you like I'm a huge fan of defense and
Mm-hmm.
rebounds. He could give you that, or he could give you scoring one night, or in that George game was kind of a microcosm, right? He had that long pass at the end of regulation, and then he made that 3-point shot in overtime. So the I think players that just kind of attract fans, and teams that kind of spread the ball around and everyone gets involved. And I think that's kind of nostalgic for a lot of us who are sports fans, who we really think of as, we kind of put ourselves in that moment at any one time. We sometimes are the one getting the rebound, or we're thinking about making that pass to the the buzzer beater layup or whatever, something like that. So I feel that's something that really attracted those fans.
And another thing that made that moment so great that tied it, put it into overtime, you're talking about a sideline out of bounds play in the backcourt, a play that doesn't happen very often. It only happens in very particular situations, late in game, that you're going to have any pressure on it. John Wallace makes a pass that he has no business making to get to Jason Sapola. And Jason Sapola is probably the second most popular player on that team. He started out the season, Jeff, as the sixth man on that roster. He's a shooting guard, but one of the problems that Syracuse had early on and early in the season is, we all know Jim Boeheim is a huge proponent of playing zone defense. And he had Marius Giannis at that two guard position, who was, really only a guy that's like, 6'5". And so he went higher, 6'7", 6'7.5" with Jason Sapola. And that really made a huge difference in terms of their defense and their ability to not just box out and rebound, but to steal and start fast breaks. And Jason Sapola sort of became that shooting guard, even though he wasn't as good a shooter as Giannis, but he was in more and he was playing more. And to be able to see him get that big shot, and from the guy, from John Wallace, it could not have been scripted more perfectly for Syracuse.
Yeah. So going back to the difference between the Carmelo Anthony team and that team, and I think that they couldn't have been more different in terms of personality, in terms of just, if you're a younger fan and you've kind of grown up in that era of swagger and who's the GOAT, and all those sort of hot takes that you get, yeah, you're probably gravitating towards the Carmelo Anthony team. And if you grew up in an era of, I remember the NBA going back to the 90s, where you had, in the 80s, you had, it's a lot physical and team play and defense and all the fundamentals. And so I think it's really reflective of maybe two different generations of fans.
Yeah, it was. And it was just so great to see Syracuse go on that run. I don't know if you remember a fellow who was on that team. He didn't play a lot, went by the name of Donovan McNabb. He was on the bench for that team. He played a whole lot more in next year, but Donovan McNabb, I remember, he's two-sport player, and he would always join the basketball team after the football season was over. But what was amazing is after they go ahead and they win in the Sweet 16 and they move on to the Elite Eight, they got a Kansas team
Mm-hmm.
that was expected to roll all over them. And it wasn't this a nice story about Syracuse. They run up against Kansas in the Elite Eight with who? With Paul Pierce, with Rafe LaFrance, with Jacques Vaughn. These are guys that all played in the league, and Syracuse took it to them all the way through into the Final Four. They beat Mississippi State before they just ran into too much with Kentucky. And when they hit Kentucky and your guy, Rick Pitino, at head coach, 9 guys on that Kentucky roster went to the NBA. It was just a little too much for Syracuse, but what a great run.
It's funny. I was watching the March Madness this past weekend, and seeing a lot of players that, it's hard to follow every team. So there's a lot of players you're not really familiar with, and you watch, and you're like, oh, that looks really fun. And I always have to remind myself that this is probably the only time you're ever going to see these players, because a lot of these guys aren't going on to the NBA, but they seem so good at the college level. And it's just a reminder that sometimes in the college game, teams playing as a unit, playing together, playing that fundamental style ball, it can really carry a team. And I think that speaks a lot to the Syracuse team from '96.
Yeah, and it's funny you mentioned, those guys that are great in college, but that's the last you see of them. And that's really Ole Miss. And Ole Miss, you posted about them as well, that Ole Miss, I think it was 2013, right, that they won their first SEC championship tournament in 32 years. And you want to talk about a team with no NBA players that was led by 2 guys who were fantastic in college, made no mark on the basketball world after that. And that was the backcourt Murphy Holloway and Marshall Henderson from Ole Miss.
Yeah, and it was also, they made the tournament in first time in 11 years. So that team really seemed like they were getting it together. And you have to talk about Andy Kennedy with that team. Who
yes.
Coach, he led that team, and probably the greatest team that Ole Miss men's basketball has ever had.
Yeah, it was kind of an odd era for Ole Miss, because Ole Miss had not really had much success prior. There was a short little window of, they're making the tournament 3 out of 4 years, but they're a football school, but they're really a baseball school.
Right.
And so their Ole Miss is just kind of, it's there, it's in the SEC, they're pretty good, but they're just one of the teams that you have to beat if you're Auburn or Alabama or Georgia to go on and win your SEC title. And, when they had Andy Kennedy came in, that was really sort of a moment that they're like, we're going to put a lot of effort and we're going to put a lot of energy into this team. And it got off to a pretty rocky start because Andy Kennedy had a number of off-field issues. So they were at a tournament and he got in a fist fight with a cab driver, and he punched the cab driver and he got arrested and spent the night in jail before they played their game that day. And they were a little bit of like, do we keep Andy Kennedy? Do we not keep Andy Kennedy? Do we give him an extension? Do we not give him an extension? Let's not give him an extension. Let's see how he does, right? Makes the tournament. They're happy. All right, we're going to give him an extension. We're going to keep him around. And it was always that sort of tug and push and pull with Andy Kennedy of, we think he's the guy that can take us in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
We don't know if there's enough on the court to keep him. And we also are seeing a history of off-field issues, not just from him, but from Marshall Henderson, who was his number 1 top player. And the whole thing just sort of fizzled out into this glorious spark of what could have been.
Well, and I think with a school like Ole Miss and the basketball program, I think you always have to moderate your expectations, right? What's that program going to be? They're never going to be a team that you're going to see win or compete for the SEC tournament championship every year, right? But they're going to have there are some years where they do really well, and I mean, he had 245 wins over his career, and his record was 245 and 156. So that's pretty good for a school that's really not a basketball school. And okay, maybe he punches a cab driver every once in a while. So,
Well, yeah. In his defense, he said it was the cab driver's fault because there weren't enough seatbelts, and he said he had to put the seatbelt on. And he's like, yeah, but there isn't one. And he's like, well, I can only take 4 people. I can't take 5. And he's like, you can take 5. First. And then right. So there is that. But he also said he recruited some guys that maybe had a little bit of issue and problem. And when you think about who's the anti-John Wallace, you end up with Marshall Henderson, who is the shooting guard at Ole Miss during this time that they were, making this run at the SEC tournament and into the NCAA tournament. And one of the great quotes about Marshall Henderson is he never lost a party, ever. He's undefeated at campus parties. And that was really where his focus was. He had a sort of checkered past. He started at Utah and he got suspended at Utah and ultimately kicked out of Utah and went to Texas Tech. And before he could even play at Texas Tech, he had got kicked off of the Texas Tech team, had to go down to junior college, won a national championship at junior college, and then found his way sort of at Ole Miss. But he was that guy that was sort of, he's right on the edge. And I think Ole Miss looked at a guy like Marshall Henderson and a coach like Andy Kennedy and said, is this what we want our face to be?
I think with Andy Kennedy, the questions that started emerging were sort of how he left, right? Because it was, well, I'm going to finish off the year. And then a week later, he's like, I'm a distraction to the team. I don't want to be a distraction to the team. And he stepped down immediately. And I don't know what it is about Ole Miss, but they seem to have a history of that, at least recently. So, what do you make of that? Sometimes it's hard to really know what the real story is behind that. But, obviously the elephant in the room is Lane Kiffin, right? So,
yeah. So it makes you think about the two. And I know that there's sort of a lot when Lane Kiffin whole thing happened this year, at least around the Ole Miss program in the community, there was a lot of same old Ole Miss, right? Look, they did Andy Kennedy dirty. He was the best coach in the history of the basketball program. They refused to give him an extension. And so he just said, you know what, I'm leaving. I'm out of here. I'm not going to deal with this. Am I going to be here next year? Am I not going to be here next year? I'm going to walk. I'm going to leave. And that was the same sort of thing that happened with Lane Kiffin but in a different way, in that Lane Kiffin, Ole Miss desperately wanted him to stay. They offered him an extension. They matched what LSU had offered him. But I think Ole Miss in the heart of hearts knew at the end of the day that Lane Kiffin was going to go, that even if it wasn't LSU this year, it was going to be Alabama, it was going to be Georgia, or it was going to be somewhere that had deeper pockets that Lane Kiffin felt was a better job.
Yeah, and it wasn't like it was the same athletic director, two different athletic directors. It was. Mm-hmm. It's not even like the next guy was a protege of the previous guy, so they had the same. Keith Carter was over Andy Kennedy, and who followed Carter wasn't really a protege. So it's not like
Keith Carter was Lane Kiffin. Ross Bjork was Andy Kennedy.
Yeah, sorry. Thanks for correcting me. But it wasn't like they had any real connection in terms of professional style or anything like that. There's probably a lot fewer similarities than there's a lot more similarities with the how the two coaches were let go.
Yeah, and I think there was a lot of hurt feelings in Oxford. And so there was sort of that connection to attack the school. But I think we said when it comes down to it, I think Lane Kiffin was going to be gone really no matter what Ole Miss did, because it's weird when you have somebody like Lane Kiffin, because Lane Kiffin shot straight up to the top. He was the hot guy,
right?
Tennessee, USC, the Raiders, and when it all fell apart for Lane Kiffin, the golden child, the next great football mind, and he had to rebuild himself at Florida Atlantic, you can go sort of one of two ways when it comes to that. You can either get a huge heap of humble pie and be grateful when you get that opportunity at the SEC school at Ole Miss and say, you know what, they have been good to me. We have had success here. I am a builder of young men, and I am a builder of a program, and I'm going to stay here, and we're going to make something of Ole Miss. And I think that's what the fan base was hoping for and expecting.
Right.
That's not Lane Kiffin. Lane Kiffin is, y'all fired me? You fired me, USC? You fired me, Tennessee? I'm going to show you what you fired. And I am going to use Ole Miss until I can use LSU. And I'm going to show all of you, because I am not taking humble pie. It was your mistake. You should be humbled that you fired me. And that's the difference, I think, between what Ole Miss fans had hoped for in Lane Kiffin and what they got in Lane Kiffin. And I think with Andy Kennedy, there was more of a want to and a willingness that Andy Kennedy said, hey, I can be here for 25 years. I can be here for 30 years. But if I'm going to commit to you, you have to commit to me. And I don't want to keep going through this every 4 years that I have to worry about whether or not I'm going to get my extension. And just to be fair to Ole Miss, there is a law in Mississippi that they cannot give extensions for longer than 4 years.
Oh, really?
So there is that. So that's one of the things where he's like, oh, well, every 4 years we're going to run into this. It's going to be a prove it year. And I think he just sort of had enough of that and said, you know what, I'm out of here. I'm gonna take a year off. I'm gonna do TV. And then he ended up at his alma mater at UAB, and he's pretty happy there from what I can tell.
No, I didn't know that about there's a law. They can't do more than 4 years.
Yeah, they're very much like the UC system or even the system here in Nevada with UNLV, the Board of Regents, where they're state schools, they're lawmakers involved in how they can do certain things, and and whenever you have academics and politicians trying to legislate sports, things like this happen. So.
Well, I know you're a big fan of Oxford. You and I have talked a lot about
Oxford's great
and how much you love it. I want to give you an opportunity to just opine about how much you like it.
I do. Oxford is a fantastic place. It is wonderful. But you know what? And as much as the Egg Bowl is a huge thing, you're either Ole Miss or you're Mississippi State. Like I said, I'm not from the state, so I enjoy them both. I've been to both Oxford, and I've been to Starkville. I've been to Hattiesburg. Mississippi is one of the great undiscovered jewels of the United States, and it gets a whole lot of crap from a bunch of people that have never been there. But it is a fantastic place to go see a college football game, to go see a college baseball game or a basketball game, or just hang out and enjoy the beauty and the nature of the state of Mississippi.
I was out at some restaurant here in Southern California, and I was wearing my Ole Miss shirt that you bought me, and I got bumped to the front of the line because the cashier was like, "Are you from Mississippi?" And I said, "Oh, I just happen to like Ole Miss." He's like, "I help you right up here." Got a little perk.
Nice. There you go. It's really great, and like I said, a really great place to eat. There's some fantastic seafood and barbecue down in Mississippi. So if you get the chance, go enjoy.
Yeah. So I wanted to also talk a little bit about really 2 different days. 1 second. Sorry, I got a little frog in my throat. I wanted to talk about 2 different days where we talked about great players on teams that never really sort of met the expectation of the greatness of those players. So we had James Harden and the Rockets on one day, and on that day, James Harden had scored 30 points against every single NBA team in the single season, which is mind-blowing to me. And then on the next day, we talked about Renaldo had got his 50th hat trick, and he's in league play. He got the most career hat tricks. He got another number of other accolades, but these are 2 players. So Harden's never won an NBA championship. That's always been a knock against him. He's won in the Olympics, and Renaldo has never won a World Cup. And so, we see this from time to time in sports, but does that detract from their legacy? And what do you make of their legacy?
I feel like it's one of those things that if you are a Ronaldo fan and you're a James Harden fan, it is easy to brush aside. And if you're a James Harden hater or you're a Ronaldo hater, it's something that you get to point to and say, look, they didn't do this.
Right.
Right? But I have always been a thought of that championships in team sports, there is a certain amount of luck and timing
Sure.
that goes along with it. There that whole, there is no I in team, and I get there is an M and there is an E, and you put them together and it does spell me, right?
Right.
But it can't always be the overriding factor, particularly when in the NBA side, when there's only one championship a year to be won.
Mm-hmm.
There's only going to be 12 to 15 guys that are going to get one. And when you look at Karl Malone and John Stockton and Carmelo Anthony and Steve Nash and who else? Patrick Ewing is another guy. Allen Iverson, Charles Barkley, right? That have never, ever won. Dominique Wilkins. There's a lot of guys that have never won. And part of that is you cannot win an NBA championship with one guy. You can't even win it with a scoring leader. You can't win it with somebody that does one thing really well. And that's what I see James Harden. He's a decent facilitator, doesn't play a lot of defense, doesn't rebound, is a really good scorer. But James Harden, I think, has always been a piece. He's not been the guy.
Yeah, and you talked a little bit about timing. It's all relative, right? Or you might be a great team, but there could be an even greater team. So it's all about timing that season, and I think even for that year that he scored 30 points against every team in the NBA, and if you ask someone off, do you think he won the MVP that year? Almost everyone would say, of course he did. Mm-hmm. But he ran up against a Giannis who had just a monster year that year, and people talk about Harden, Westbrook and Durant when they were on OKC together. Look at that talent. Of course that team would have won. Why didn't they win? But they were young, right? They were still kind of putting it together. And there's probably personality issues because we all know those three have personalities. But they also ran up against the Miami Heat that were obviously an amazing team. And then when the Rockets, when Harden was doing all that scoring and he had some pretty nice role players and complementary pieces, it was the peak of the Warriors, which was one of the all-time great teams. And so I think you're right. It's sort of, they're always I like to play poker as second best hand, right? You could have an amazing hand, right, but you run up against that person who flops a full house against your flush or something like that. So.
Yeah, and it's disingenuous to hold something like that against Harden, and at the same time, speak out of two sides of your mouth and be like, hey, well, Harden, you should have had 4 championships. And Chris Paul, you should have had 3 championships. And Durant, you should have had 4 championships. And LeBron, if you want to be as good as Mike, you should have had 2 more championships. And the Warriors, that dynasty, that should have had 6, right? And all of a sudden, now you've got 15 championships that should have been won in an 8-year period. So I just think when you look at Harden, what his legacy is, that Harden is who he is. Harden is a really good player in an era of great players, and I don't think anyone would ever put Harden into the conversation of who's the greatest basketball player. Right? You're going to have that conversation. You're going to talk about Jordan. You're going to talk about LeBron, and you're going to talk about Kobe and Wilt and Bill Russell and Kareem and maybe Steph, but you're not going to get to James Harden on that conversation, no matter how much you love James Harden, or no matter how big of a Rockets fan you are, or now how big of a Cavs fan you are. But in Ronaldo's case, you're not going to have a conversation with who's the greatest soccer player without having Ronaldo. You're going to be, is it Ronaldo? Is it Messi? Is it Pele? Right? And then there's going to be a drop off, and then there's everybody else. So when it comes to Ronaldo, it's probably a more fair conversation to say he didn't win the biggest event, but I would still say that's fine because now you're whittling down his greatness to how his team and his country performs in a 7 or 8 game tournament that happens every 4 years.
Yeah, I think just real quickly on Harden, not to go back too much, but I think to be fair, also, you have to look at the performances in the postseason play. How does his style match up in postseason play? And I think there's a little bit of a knock there where his style is a little bit better during regular season, and it doesn't necessarily translate over to playoffs where they can sort of plan some defensive schemes around
Mm-hmm.
his trying to draw the foul and his step back and so forth.
Yeah.
And then I wanted to just transition over to talking about Renaldo with that fact was maybe his play does translate on the World Cup stage, but unlike Harden, he hasn't had as many. The talent around him has been even less than what Harden would have in his supporting cast. I think
exactly. And Portugal has done
a
great job of getting into the top 10, and I think currently they're ranked 6th in FIFA. But that hasn't always been the case, and it's not as if Portugal can just go out and get him some help. You are stuck with eligibility requirements, and there is let's not act like there's not a fair amount of free agency and international citizenship when it comes to qualifying. We just saw that in the World Baseball Classic. We saw it in the Olympics. We're going to see it in the World Cup, but it's not as simple as, hey, it's not working out with the Clippers. Can you trade me to Cleveland? Like it is for Harden,
Right.
And I think for Renaldo, a guy that's got 965 goals, I think, as of today, compared to Messi's 901. That's a big goal gap for the two of them. And yeah, Messi has won a World Cup. He did it last time out with Argentina, but with a significantly better team around him than what Renaldo has. And I think if Renaldo, and this will probably be his last World Cup, he's over 40 now. I don't think that you would ever be able to say, well, Messi won 1 and Pele won 3 and you won none, so we're not really going to talk about you. You can't be the greatest because you didn't win the World Cup.
Right.
There's a lot more randomness in the winning of the World Cup, I think, that even in the winning of the NBA championship. And I would not hold out against him, like I said, for a 7-game, 8-game tournament every 4 years.
Yeah, it's so. I think relativism is really something that's sticking out to me in a lot of what we're talking about. And for me, that's why I hate, for me, baseball's my favorite sport, as you know. And I think, there's always those conversations about, how would Ted Williams do against Paul Skeens or whatever arguments you want to make. And it's so hard to evaluate players from different eras and moving on to something that was posted about boxing, and you remember Frank Bruno.
Oh, I love Frank Bruno.
He fought against Tyson. Yeah, and so in 1996, Mike Tyson only 3 fights out after getting out of prison. He fought Frank Bruno, and I think Frank Bruno felt he had a little bit of success facing Tyson earlier in his career, and he did what a lot of fighters couldn't do, was get to Tyson a little bit, although he ultimately lost that match as well, but he survived a little bit longer than a lot of boxers did. So in this in 1996, he gave it another try and went after Tyson. Unfortunately, didn't work out for him, but I think people try to evaluate every boxer from that era against Tyson, and it's really hard to do. And it's a relative thing, right? If you're going to evaluate everyone against Tyson, not many fighters survived against Tyson. And Lennox Lewis, even not many boxers matched up well against Lennox Lewis. But people forget that Frank Bruno he left with a record of 40-5, and 38 of his wins came via knockout. That's pretty good.
Yeah, he had a 95% knockout rate in his fights. And let's not forget, yes, he lost 5 fights. He lost 2 of them to Tyson, right? But then when you look at the others that he lost to Bone Crusher Smith, who was heavyweight champion of the world, right? He lost to Lennox Lewis, who was heavyweight champion of the world. and he lost to Tim Witherspoon, who was heavyweight champion of the world.
Right.
So Frank Bruno belongs in that conversation. Somebody's got to lose, right? And so Frank Bruno, unfortunately, was that guy. He did win the world title once he beat Oliver McCall. He got his world championship. Unfortunately, like you said, he ran into Tyson. He didn't get to defend his title. He lost it in his first defense, and that was his last fight. He had a detached retina in his eye that ended his career. He was about time for him to retire anyway, but he didn't box again after that Tyson fight. But I think if you just look at Frank Bruno as, he's just a guy, a ham and egger, you've completely missed how good Frank Bruno is. It makes me think of Nadine Visser and Marie-Josée Toulouse. And you will always see Nadine Visser and Marie-Josée Toulouse in the finals at the Olympics, at the Diamond League, at the World Championships. They're always in the race. They don't hit the podium, but they're always there. Like you can always count every 100 meters, every 200 meters, Marie-Josée Toulouse is going to be there. She's going to get beat by Sha'Carri Richardson. She's going to get beat by the Mommy Rocket, right? But she's going to be there. Same with Nadine Visser. She's going to be in that 10-meter hurdle or 100-meter hurdle race. She's going to get beat. She's going to be there. And that was Frank Bruno. But just massive power, massive appeal. And just to see him, if you always watch highlights of him, just to see him knock guys out of the ring through the ropes. I love it. It's impressive.
Well, yeah, and you mentioned Oliver McCall. McCall actually beat Lennox Lewis and Larry Holmes. So it's not like McCall was just like nobody. I mean, he was, he was a legit boxer. So I think Bruno was probably for most of his career, every year, he was a top 10 boxer, sometimes top 5 boxer. So again, it's this relative idea that it's relative. And I love your point that you made that only one person can win the championship. Only one person can win one team, one athlete can win the finals. It doesn't take away from how great some of the other athletes are.
Right. And when you look at what his legacy has done now, I think particularly anybody maybe born post 95 thinks about the Brits as being that's the place that you go for great fighters.
Yeah.
Because there's been a handful of them in the 2000s and 20. But when you look at the legacy of British heavyweight boxing, it is not good. It is not good at all. You have to go all the way back to like Bob Fitzsimmons in the 1800s before you're finding a heavyweight that's a Brit that is a champion. And I know people will say Lennox Lewis. Lennox Lewis is sort of British. He's not really British. He was born in England. He moved to Canada when he was 12. He fought in Canada. He grew up in Canada. He went to high school in Canada. He fought at the Olympics for Canada.
That's right.
And then he realized, I can make more money doing commercials being British. So I'm going to be British and go back to Britain because they care more about boxing there, and I can do more commercials and more personal appearances. And that's why he's British, but he's really Canadian.
That's right.
But if you look at David Haye, right, or you look at Anthony Joshua or Tyson Fury, all of these guys grew up in a British boxing world created by Frank Bruno, because Frank Bruno was as popular as any athlete in Britain during the late 80s and throughout the 90s.
You brought up Deontay Wilder and Anthony Joshua, and I wanted to see sort of that those are the more relevant contemporary boxers that I think if fans are watching right now. Where do you think Frank Bruno falls in terms of style, or how is he compared to the kind of those contemporaries?
I think he's more Anthony Joshua than Deontay Wilder. Deontay Wilder is aptly perfectly named in Wilder because he swings and from great distance. And I think always the knock on Bruno looked like a bodybuilder, and so does Anthony Joshua. And they both are a little bit stiff and a little bit needing to get that power shot. And that was always part of the problem with Bruno, is that his stamina, sometimes he would be winning fights and 8th, 9th, 10th round, he could get caught That's certainly how he lost his first championship opportunity when he fought Bone Crusher Smith. He was leading on all the cards after 8 rounds, and then he just got caught
Yeah.
because he got a little tired. But I think that Wilder is more of a. I wouldn't say that he's like Tyson in that Tyson was very compact and very short and very quick, but he is style in that Wilder's always going to come forward and always going to come at you. Where Bruno was more sort of lay back, find a shot, tie you up until the opportunity was there. Very much more like Anthony Joshua.
Yeah, I think they call it textbook, not stiff.
No, I would call him stiff. I would not call him
Right.
textbook. I would call him stiff. And I think a lot of people would. I think if you sat down with Jim Lampley or Larry Merchant or any of those guys, they would say Frank Bruno was stiff, a lot of power, but he was a little stiff. And I bet money on that one.
Okay, all right. So I want to move on to someone who didn't receive as much accolades, but seemed to really immediately rise to the top and was able to knock off the champ. And it's in a completely different sport, completely different era, because we posted about Peggy Kirk Bell, women's golfer from the 1940s. In fact, it was on the March 20th back in 1949 that Peggy Kirk Bell won her first and only major title at the LPGA Title Holders Championship, which, for people who don't know, that was the big LPGA major back then. And she beat some of the all-time greatest golfers in that tournament. She was an amateur. And she beat Patty Berg, Dorothy Kirk, and Babe Dietrichson Zaharias, who is probably the greatest female athlete of all time, maybe golfer, and she was highly talented in many other sports. So, really interesting that, this is her one and only championship. She ended up leaving golf after that and went on to work to, run a business, and she had a great career as a coach and a teacher of golf. A really interesting story with her.
Yeah, it's funny that it comes right off of boxing because she stared the champ in the face and knocked him out. And, think about somebody that gets 1 or 2 or 3 chances at glory, and she took that opportunity and she beat Patty Berg and Babe Dietrichson Zaharias. And a lot of people probably have not heard of Patty Berg, but Patty Berg is a Hall of Fame LPGA player. She actually is one of the founding members of creating the LPGA. Let's not forget, this is 1949. The LPGA is not going to exist until the next year in 1950. Right? So it's not even a thing. And you think about, poor Peggy Kirk, she just had that one chance and she made the best of it. But there were only 11 events on the entire 1949 calendar. Now there's an LPGA event every week, but you're talking about 11 over the course of a year. She was an amateur. She knew she couldn't make any money. The PGA Tour was fledgling, and the LPGA Tour didn't even exist. So she took her win and she spent the rest of her life as a golf coach. And not only was she inducted into the Hall of Fame, but she's also into the Golf Coaches Hall of Fame. And that's where she spent the rest of her life.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing about her and her success, and I think it speaks to a lot of what we've been talking about today, is stressing the fundamentals. That was her primary key to success. In fact, she worked with Ben Hogan, who taught her, instructed her on her grip, and that's what she really focused on. That she was a really obsessive type personality and athlete when it came to really perfecting those fundamentals, making sure her swing was precise. And I think when we look back at some of the great athletes, we talked about some of the athletes like Harden, and just kind of thinking about how well she really kind of took to her craft. And it's unfortunate that it was really at a place. Women's golf was in such an amateur world where she really didn't have the opportunity to progress, because it would have been amazing to see how well and how far her career could have gone.
Yeah, I think if she were alive today and she were playing, that she would have really benefited from the routine and from the immense amount of events that there are. Because you can look at somebody like Harden, who maybe doesn't do everything fundamentally well. He makes a lot of shots, falling backwards, off angles, things like that. Golf is one of those games where, or one of those sports, you can't get away with bad fundamentals.
Yeah.
You can hit the lucky odd shot. You can run up and do the Happy Gilmore off the tee, and every once in a while you're going to drill it right down the fairway. But if you do it 100 times, you're going to end up in the weeds.
Right.
And that's not the case for somebody like Peggy Kirk. You have to be good at the fundamentals. You have to be willing to do them over and over and over and over again. And I think that repetition and that length of schedule and long season that is afforded to the women of the LPGA Tour now would have really served her well.
Yeah, and I think golf is an area where a sport that becomes even more pronounced, because you can have you can go with your friends and you can be hitting around on the recreational course and have a great game, but it's being able to do it under the extreme stress, extreme pressure, and being able to repeat those fundamentals exactly every time. I think every sport, obviously, that comes into play, but golf is probably what the big difference maker is, because it's really just you. You're not, there's no, it's not like baseball where there's some pitching to you and there's, not defenders around you like in basketball. So I think her obsessive nature with those fundamentals, and the fact that, now we think of athletes relying on more experienced athletes or thinking a little bit outside the box, but her going to Ben Hogan, that was just something completely unheard of in her time.
Mm-hmm. And don't forget, she's doing all of this without video.
Right.
She's doing all of this with just feel and trying to replicate what she's learned and trying to do it the same each time, or make adjustments, for the wind. And let's not also forget, at the clubs they were using at the time, that your sweet spot, is tiny, and now your sweet spot is
right.
And to be able to do it with no video and crappy equipment, it's pretty amazing. And then to stare down and beat Babe Didrikson Zaharias, who won 10 LPGA majors, and let's not forget, she also won 3 Olympic medals, 2 of them gold, in the hurdles and the javelin.
Right.
As if they go together. And then she got her silver in the high jump. So what a neat lady. And I'm sure we'll have a post about her someday in the future.
Yeah, I love talking about Babe Didrikson Zaharias, so we'll make sure to have something on her in the future. I wanted to kind of close this out talking about another greatest who's under a dark cloud. And it's Erik Zabel, the German cyclist. And we posted about Erik. He won his first of 4 Milan-San Remo races. That's actually the third most. 4 would be the third most ever won by any cyclist. And he is regarded as one of the greatest sprinters, although later on he confessed to doping. And then after that, he confessed to long-term doping. So now his career's under a dark cloud. But I know you're a huge cycling fan. Where do you put Erik Zabel in?
I am. And Erik Zabel is like, he is a great sprinter in one of the greatest, most tainted times in cycling. So if you look at the 90s, late 80s, all through the 90s in cycling, and you want to know what it was like, think about, if you're a baseball fan, it was the same thing. It was the steroid era, the doping era of cycling. And if you wanted to compete, well, you better be on the juice, because everybody that was winning was, and you're going to find yourself out of a contract, out of a job, out of the back of the peloton. And so Eric Zabel won 152 pro races, and he won a lot of really big races, and he won the green jersey at the Tour de France. And the green jersey is for overall placing consistency over the 21 stages and overall consistency at certain points in the race. They'll have special sprints that first ones across the line accumulate these points. It's the yellow jersey or the victory for the sprinters, because there's no way the sprinters can win the entire Tour de France. So there's a special contest for them. So he won that 6 times. He won that same competition at the Vuelta 3 times. Everything he did was almost perfect in terms of being able to get into the right spot. And the way that I look at him is the same way that I look at Sammy Sosa and Mark McGuire, Alex Rodriguez, Barry Bonds, those guys. Barry Bonds still had to hit the ball, right? He still had to hit it. He might have had all the juice in the world, but he still had to hit a 100-mile-an-hour pitch. And that's the way with Eric Zabel was. He may have been taking the juice, but so was everyone else in the peloton. He still had to get into the right spot in a mass sprint in order to get to that line first. And that takes a special kind of courage and a special kind of athlete to be able to get into position when you're inch and a half, quarter of an inch off the other person's wheel going 40 miles an hour. And for that, I think that it doesn't really taint for me his greatness that he was the best doping sprinter in an era of doping sprinters.
Yeah, and I think it goes back to what I was mentioning about sort of relative, right? There is that era of baseball players who were all, Barry Bonds, Mark McGuire, as you said, Sammy Sosa, Roger Clemens, all those players were, they're in that group. They're in the juicing era group. And then you have the cyclists. And one thing I wanted to mention, because I think a lot of people watching this who maybe don't know as much about cycling, and everyone automatically thinks of Lance Armstrong.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's the most famous of that group, and especially in the United States. So when we talk about greatest sprinters, I don't think people think, oh, well, who's the greatest cyclist, right? But there's different type. There's sprinters and there's overall. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that's something that's important to really differentiate between.
Yeah, there are 2 types of races that you will have over the World Tour cycling calendar. So there are stage races and there are one-day classics. And the one-day classic is exactly what it sounds. It is a one-day race. You begin the race and you end the race, and whoever wins that day is the winner of the race. And then you all move on to somewhere else the next time that you want to race. And there are a handful of one-day races. There are what are called 5 classic monuments. They're like the majors. So if you think about, Wimbledon and the French Open and the Australian Open and the US Open being that for tennis, that's what these races are in terms of cycling. Milan-San Remo is one of those races that he won 4 times. And then there are stage races, and that is things like the Tour de France, the Vuelta de España, the Giro d'Italia, the Tour of Switzerland, the Tour Down Under. Those are multi-day stage races where you will have anywhere from 8 stages, 8 days long, to 21 stages long, and you add the cumulative time as you go over the course, and you add the cumulative time, and at the end of the 21 days, whoever has the fastest cumulative time is the winner. Now, within a particular stage race or even a one-day monument, they're designed to produce one of 3 outcomes is the most likely. They're either a mountain stage, which is to see who can get at the end of a race up the mountain the fastest, right? And they'll sort of drop members of the peloton all the way across the run. There's a breakaway stage, which is designed to see which racers and which little group can get ahead of the major group of riders, which is called the peloton. And there's also sprint stages or sprint races where the race is designed so that the entire field is all together in the last kilometer, and it's a sprint to the finish. And that's the races that he particularly specialized in, are the sprint stages and the sprint races where it is designed that if you have 150 riders, all 150 of them are coming together with 1 kilometer to go. And now you've got to get in position, beat all 150 riders in a mass sprint across a 2-lane road with barriers on the side where everyone's going 45 miles an hour. Uh, it's pretty hair raising, and there's a lot of times that there are crashes in the last 200 meters, and a lot of guys get really messed up flipping over the handlebars. If you want to know what it's like to crash on your bicycle, hang out your car door going about 50 miles an hour, 45, 50 miles an hour, and jump onto an asphalt road in your underwear. That's what it's like when you crash in one of these races. And so that's why I say, a guy like Eric Zabel having to get into the right position in order to win these races with a whole bunch of people around him with his tire a quarter of an inch off the tire in front of him. It takes a special kind of human being to be able to do that, and to do that well, and to do it consistently.
I'm going to try that with my car door in my underwear, but I'm going to be wearing a helmet, because you're supposed to always wear your helmet.
Yes. But, when Eric Zabel was running, that helmet wasn't a requirement.
Oh, okay.
So there were a lot of those guys that, were running without helmets. But, Eric Zabel, for me, I think you can't tell the story of cycling without him. He was the best of his generation. The reason that he hasn't lost all of his titles is because the statute of limitations has ended on their drug investigation. Lance Armstrong got caught at the wrong time. That's why Lance Armstrong, there's a number of people in his era that are not losing anything because it's all coming to light afterwards. But Jan Ullrich and Mario Cipollini and Claudio Chiappucci and Bo Hamburger and Damaladin Abdujaparov, all of those guys, all of them, every single one of them was on the juice.
I think it's interesting that, as much as Lance Armstrong is demonized in the United States, Zabel is still hugely celebrated in Germany.
Yeah, hugely celebrated, and he was working as a director sportif for one of the pro teams recently over the past couple of seasons, and so he's still celebrated. Lance Armstrong's had to pay for every cyclist's sins. Yeah. There's all the rest of them have all been given a pass in terms of not being able to be investigated, or no one's cared. Claudio Chiappucci, they were just reopening an investigation to him, and Tadej Pogacar, who's the number one cyclist, was coming out and he's crying in the interview and saying he's a hero, he's not a criminal, leave the man alone. But Lance Armstrong nailed to the cross.
All right, well, we're gonna wrap up. I want to ask you on our way out here. I know cycling, you're such a huge fan. What's your bucket list cycling event to go see?
Well, I've got to see a stage of the Tour de France, even though you're only going to see them whiz by super quick. Yeah. I did see Greg LeMond in a race once, and Alexia Greywall, 1984 Olympic road racing gold medalist. But it's cool. It's unbelievable how fast they go by you.
Yeah. Well, we'll go and watch them whiz by while we eat our croissants. How about that?
Yes, absolutely.
All right, Clayton, that's great discussion as always. Love chatting history with you, and we'll opening day coming up. I'm sure we'll have some baseball talk next week.
Sounds great.
Take it easy, everyone. Thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.